The most dangerous man in Chicago didn't threaten me, didn't raise his voice, and didn't try to impress me. The problem was that after I told him no, he wouldn't stop thinking about me. The rain tapped softly against the front windows of Bennett Books as I flipped the sign from open to closed and glanced at the clock above the register. 8:47 p.m. Another quiet Thursday in Cedar Creek, Illinois. Another night spent shelving novels, recommending mysteries to retirees, and pretending I wasn't 25 years old with a future that looked exactly like my present. The bookstore had belonged to my grandmother for almost 40 years, and after her health started failing, keeping it alive became my responsibility. It wasn't glamorous. It barely paid the bills. But it was home. I locked the door, grabbed my coat, and stepped outside into the cool spring air. Main Street was nearly empty. A few pickup trucks sat parked along the curb. The diner across the street glowed beneath a flickering neon sign. Everything felt familiar, safe, predictable. That should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a cage. I was halfway to my old Honda when headlights swept across the street. A black SUV rolled into town like it had taken a wrong turn on its way to another world. The vehicle was spotless despite the rain. Expensive. Out of place. Every head on Main Street seemed to turn toward it. Mine included. The SUV stopped directly in front of the bookstore. A second SUV pulled up behind it. Then another. 3 vehicles. Tinted windows. Silent engines. The kind of arrival that made people stop talking. One of the rear doors opened. A tall man stepped onto the sidewalk. Dark coat. Dark hair. The posture of someone completely certain the world belonged to him. He looked around once, calmly, as if evaluating the entire town in a single glance. I didn't know his name then. Ethan Moretti. But I could feel something unusual about him immediately. Not because he looked dangerous. Because everyone around him looked careful. 2 men remained a few steps behind him without being asked. A woman exiting the diner nearly walked into a parking meter because she couldn't stop staring. Ethan ignored all of it. His attention landed on me. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he started walking toward the bookstore. Toward me. My stomach tightened. Not from fear. From irritation. I had seen men like him before. Wealthy tourists passing through small towns looking for a charming story to tell their friends back in the city. They always looked at places like Cedar Creek as if we existed for their entertainment. He stopped a few feet away. Up close, his eyes were a cool gray blue. Calm. Observant. You own the bookstore? He asked. His voice was low and controlled. My grandmother does, I replied. I help run it. He glanced toward the windows. It's beautiful. Thank you. A pause. If you're looking to buy something, we closed 17 minutes ago. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not quite a smile. You checked the time? I always check the time. His gaze stayed on me for another second. Then I shrugged, opened my car door, and climbed inside. Good night, I said. Before he could answer, I started the engine and drove away. In my rearview mirror, he remained standing on the sidewalk, watching my taillights disappear into the rain. What I didn't know was that Ethan Moretti had spent 10 years getting everything he wanted. And for the first time in a very long time, someone had looked directly at him and walked away. The sound of rain followed me all the way home that night, tapping against the roof of my Honda like impatient fingers. By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway beside my grandmother's house, I had almost convinced myself the stranger on Main Street did not matter. People passed through Cedar Creek all the time. Wealthy travelers, businessmen, tourists looking for small-town charm. They arrived, they spent money, and they disappeared. That was how the world worked. At least, that was what I told myself. The next morning began like every other Friday. Coffee, inventory reports, a call from a supplier asking about a delayed payment I could not afford. The bookstore opened at 9, and by 10:30 I was helping Mrs. Patterson find a mystery novel she had somehow forgotten she had already read 3 times. Life was ordinary again, comfortably ordinary. Then my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and frowned. Unknown number. Normally I ignored those calls. For some reason, I answered. Claire Bennett speaking. Silence lingered for a second. Then a familiar voice said, Good morning, Claire. My stomach tightened instantly. I recognized that voice. Calm. Controlled. The kind of voice that never seemed rushed. How did you get my number? I asked. A faint pause. That is your first question? It is the only question I have right now. I heard what sounded suspiciously like amusement. I am Ethan. I figured that out. Good. I leaned against the counter. You still did not answer my question. I asked someone in town. That sounds incredibly vague. It worked. I should have hung up. Instead, I found myself staring through the bookstore window at Main Street. Why are you calling? Another pause. I wanted to know if you always dismiss people that quickly. I laughed despite myself. You call me to ask that? Yes. That might be the strangest thing anyone has ever admitted. And I am working. Then I will not keep you. His voice softened slightly. Have a good day, Claire. The line disconnected. I stared at the phone, then at the ceiling, then back at the phone. Unbelievable, I muttered. For the rest of the day, I tried not to think about him. Unfortunately, that became difficult around 3 o'clock when a delivery truck stopped outside the bookstore. A driver carried in a massive arrangement of white lilies. Every customer turned to look. Delivery for Claire Bennett. My eyes widened. There must be a mistake. The driver checked his clipboard. No mistake. He handed me a card. I opened it slowly. The message contained only 6 words. Thank you for the conversation. Ethan. I stared at the card in disbelief. No heart. No flirtation. No grand declaration. Somehow that made it worse. Because it felt intentional. Deliberate. Like a move in a game I did not realize I was playing. Across Chicago, more than 200 miles away, Ethan Moretti sat inside a glass-walled office overlooking the city skyline. One of his executives was explaining a multi-million-dollar project. Ethan heard none of it. His attention remained fixed on a security photo displayed on his phone. A photograph of a small bookstore in Cedar Creek. And the woman standing behind the counter. Sir? The executive asked nervously. Ethan finally looked up. What? Did you want to approve the proposal? Ethan glanced back at the photo, then out the window, then back at the photo again. Later, he said quietly, because for the first time in years, there was something far more interesting occupying his mind. By Monday morning, the lilies were still sitting behind the bookstore counter, and I was beginning to regret not throwing them away. Every customer who walked through the door had something to say about them. Mrs. Patterson thought I had a secret admirer. My friend Rachel thought I was hiding a billionaire boyfriend. My grandmother simply smiled every time she looked at them, which somehow made everything worse. You are thinking about him, she said while organizing a shelf of historical fiction. I am absolutely not thinking about him. She raised one eyebrow. I hated when she did that because she was usually right. The truth was that I had spent the entire weekend trying not to wonder why a man from Chicago kept appearing in my life. I knew almost nothing about Ethan Moretti, yet somehow, he had become the most confusing part of my week. Around noon, the bookstore grew quiet. Rain drifted against the windows in soft gray streaks. I was updating inventory when my computer suddenly froze. Then restarted. Then froze again. No, I whispered. The register system, inventory records, customer database, everything was stored there. I pressed keys, clicked icons. Nothing worked. My stomach dropped. A repair bill was the last thing we needed. After 20 frustrating minutes, I called the local technician. The answer was immediate and depressing. Earliest appointment is next Thursday. Next Thursday? I nearly dropped the phone. I run a business. Sorry, Claire. We are completely booked. Great. Just great. I ended the call and rubbed my forehead. Then the bell above the bookstore door chimed. A man stepped inside, carrying a black equipment case. Early 30s. Clean haircut. Professional smile. Claire Bennett. I blinked. Yes. I am here about the computer issue. My confusion deepened. I did not schedule anyone. I know. He set down the case. But someone else did. My stomach immediately sank. No. The technician smiled politely. Should only take about an hour. 2 hours later, every computer in the bookstore was running better than it had in years. New software. Faster systems. Updated security. When he finished, I asked the question I already knew the answer to. How much do I owe? Nothing. That is not possible. It has already been handled. I closed my eyes. Of course it had. The technician left. I stood alone in the bookstore staring at the perfectly functioning monitor. Then I grabbed my phone. Ethan answered before the second ring. Hello, Claire. I ignored the strange flutter of irritation in my chest. Did you send someone to my bookstore? Yes. Why? Your computer was broken. That is not an answer. It solved the problem. I paced between shelves. You cannot just fix things in my life without asking. Silence lingered for a moment. Then his voice became softer. You seem angry. I am angry. Not because I fixed the computer. I stopped walking. Somehow he sounded certain. You are angry because you do not like owing people anything. The words landed harder than they should have. Because he was right. Uncomfortably right. I stared through the rain-covered window at Main Street. You do not know me, Ethan. Maybe not yet. His answer came quietly, calmly, like a promise instead of a challenge. After the call ended, I stood there for several minutes staring at my phone. 200 miles away, Ethan sat in his office looking at a report that had never been requested. It contained details about Cedar Creek, the bookstore, the house beside the river, the woman who refused to be impressed. And for the first time in years, Ethan smiled at something other than business because every piece of information only seemed to make Claire Bennett more interesting. The first sign that something was changing appeared on a Wednesday afternoon when the bank called. I almost ignored it because banks never called with good news. They called about overdrafts, paperwork, and problems. They did not call with surprises. Miss Bennett, the representative said cheerfully, we wanted to let you know your commercial loan application has been approved. I stared at the phone. My what? Silence. Then confusion. Your application for the bookstore renovation fund. My grip tightened. I never submitted an application. The representative hesitated. According to our records, everything was completed last week. My pulse quickened. After ending the call, I immediately drove downtown. 20 minutes later, I sat across from a loan officer reviewing paperwork that supposedly carried my authorization. The signature was mine. The information was mine. Everything looked legitimate. Yet I knew I had never submitted it. The loan officer frowned while reviewing the file. Honestly, Miss Bennett, whoever prepared this did an exceptional job. That was exactly what worried me. The rain had started again by the time I left the bank. Gray clouds hung low over Cedar Creek. I sat inside my Honda staring at the windshield while one name echoed through my mind. Ethan. By the time I reached the bookstore, frustration had replaced confusion. I marched inside, grabbed my phone, and called him. He answered immediately. Claire, did you submit a loan application in my name? The silence lasted slightly too long. No. Do not lie to me. I am not lying. His voice remained calm. I did not submit anything. Then how did a complete application appear out of nowhere? Another pause. I may have asked someone to explain your options. I laughed in disbelief. You are impossible. That is not the first time I have heard that. You have no boundaries. That is probably true. My frustration should have made me hang up. Instead, I found myself pacing beside the shelves. Why are you doing this? I asked quietly. The answer did not come immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different. More honest. Less guarded. Because when I see a problem, I fix it. Not every problem belongs to you. Maybe not. Another pause. But I cannot seem to stop thinking about yours. My breath caught unexpectedly. The bookstore suddenly felt very quiet. Too quiet. Before I could answer, the bell above the door chimed. I turned. A man stood near the entrance. Mid-40s. Expensive suit. Polished smile. Completely unfamiliar. Something about him felt wrong. He looked around the bookstore slowly before his eyes settled on me. Claire Bennett, he asked. Yes. His smile widened. I have been looking forward to meeting you. A strange chill moved through me. The man stepped farther inside. Outside, another dark sedan pulled up across the street. Through the rain-covered window, I could see two figures sitting inside watching the bookstore. My stomach tightened. On the phone, Ethan immediately noticed the change in my breathing. Claire. His voice sharpened slightly. What happened? I kept staring at the stranger. There is a man here. The smile disappeared from Ethan's voice completely. Describe him. For the first time since meeting Ethan Moretti, I heard something unfamiliar beneath his calm control. Concern. The man smiled as if we had already met before. I did not recognize him, but something about the confidence in his expression made my instincts tighten. I am Daniel Mercer, he said. I represent a group of investors interested in small businesses. I kept my phone pressed against my ear. Ethan remained silent on the other end, listening. What kind of investors? I asked carefully. Daniel glanced around the bookstore. The kind who recognize potential. Outside, rain continued to slide down the windows. The dark sedan remained parked across the street. I could feel its presence even when I was not looking at it. Daniel stepped closer to a display table and picked up a novel. This place has charm, he said. Rare these days. Thank you. It could become something much bigger. There it was. The real reason he had come. I folded my arms. I am not interested in selling. His smile never changed. I did not ask whether you were selling. Then why are you here? For the first time, his eyes sharpened slightly. Because opportunities do not stay available forever. On the phone, Ethan finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm. Claire. Daniel's gaze shifted toward the phone. The smile faded just a fraction. Interesting. Very interesting. Who is that? Daniel asked. A friend, I answered. Ethan did not correct me. The silence that followed felt strangely significant. Daniel studied my expression for a moment before setting the book back down. Well, he said lightly, perhaps we can continue this conversation another time. He handed me a business card. Thick paper. Expensive. No company logo. Just a name and a phone number. Then he walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused. You should be careful, Claire. Sometimes attention from powerful people creates complications. The bell chimed as he stepped outside. I watched him cross the street and enter the waiting sedan. Moments later, the vehicle disappeared into the rain. The bookstore felt colder after he left. Claire. Ethan's voice pulled me back. Are you still there? Yes. Read me the name on the card. I did. Silence followed. Longer this time. Who is he? I asked. Someone I hoped would stay far away from Cedar Creek. My pulse quickened. That is not an answer. It is the only one I am giving right now. Frustration returned immediately. You keep doing that. Doing what? Acting like you know things I do not. A quiet exhale came through the phone. Because sometimes I do. I walked to the window and stared at the empty street. Then explain it to me. Not over the phone. Why not? Because some conversations deserve to happen face to face. The answer should have annoyed me. Instead, it made my heart beat slightly faster. Before I could respond, a familiar black SUV slowly turned onto Main Street and stopped directly in front of the bookstore. Rain shimmered across its dark exterior. My breath caught. Ethan, I whispered. Tell me that is not your vehicle. On the other end of the line, his voice softened. Look outside again. The rear door of the SUV opened, and Ethan Moretti stepped out into the rain. The rain seemed quieter the moment Ethan stepped through the bookstore door. Water glistened on the shoulders of his dark coat before he removed it and draped it over one arm. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The familiar scent of old books filled the space between us. Outside, Main Street continued moving at its usual pace, completely unaware that my ordinary life had somehow collided with his. You drove more than 200 miles because of a phone call. I finally asked. Ethan looked at me steadily. Yes. That is not normal. I never claimed to be normal. I should have laughed. Instead, I found myself studying him. In Chicago, I imagined Ethan belonged among glass towers and private offices. Here, surrounded by worn wooden shelves and handwritten recommendation cards, he looked strangely out of place, yet somehow completely comfortable. Who was that man? I asked. Ethan glanced toward the rain-covered window. Someone who pays attention when he should not. That still does not tell me anything. His jaw tightened slightly. Claire, I am trying to answer without making this more complicated than it needs to be. Frustration rose immediately. You keep deciding what I need to know. Because I am trying to keep unnecessary problems away from you. I did not ask for that. Silence settled between us. Not angry silence. Something heavier. Ethan looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. I know. The answer caught me off guard. There was no arrogance in it. No argument. Just honesty. For the first time since meeting him, he looked tired. Not physically tired. Something deeper. The kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much responsibility for too long. I folded my arms. Then why do it? He looked around the bookstore. At the shelves. The reading corner near the fireplace. The old photographs hanging behind the register. Because people like you do not exist where I come from. I blinked. People who run bookstores? People who still care about things that cannot be bought. The answer landed harder than I expected. Ethan walked slowly toward a shelf and examined the titles. Everyone around me wants something, he continued quietly. Money, influence, access, favors. He picked up a novel and turned it over in his hands. You were the first person in a very long time who looked at me and saw none of those things. The bookstore suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, not romantic, just honest, uncomfortably honest. I found myself wondering how many people ever spoke to Ethan without wanting something in return. Probably very few. You make it sound lonely, I said. A faint smile appeared. It is. The answer came so quickly that I knew it was true. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced down. An unknown number. The message contained only one sentence. Stay away from Ethan Moretti if you value your peaceful life. My stomach dropped. The color must have drained from my face because Ethan immediately noticed. What happened? I turned the screen toward him. The warmth vanished from his expression. Completely. His eyes remained fixed on the message for several seconds. Then he looked toward the front window. Across the street, a dark sedan had appeared once again. And this time, it was not leaving. The sedan remained parked across the street long after the rain had faded into a light mist. I stood beside the bookstore window watching its dark silhouette beneath the streetlights while Ethan remained unusually quiet. That silence worried me more than any warning message. Ethan was not a man who seemed easily unsettled, yet something about the situation had shifted. Tell me the truth, I said softly. Is this because of you? Ethan looked at the message on my phone again before returning it to the counter. Yes. The honesty surprised me. Then why am I just finding out now? He exhaled slowly. Because I thought I could keep my world separate from yours. I folded my arms. That did not work very well. A faint smile touched his face. No, it did not. The bookstore felt unusually warm despite the cool evening outside. The old floorboards creaked beneath our footsteps as we moved between the shelves. For the first time, Ethan looked less like an untouchable businessman and more like a man carrying regrets. When I first met you, he said quietly, I told myself you were simply interesting. I listened without interrupting. Then I started looking forward to our conversations. His eyes met mine. Then I started finding reasons to call. Something fluttered unexpectedly inside my chest. That sounds dangerously close to an admission. It probably is. The honesty caught me off guard again. There was no manipulation in his voice. No performance. Just truth. Outside, the sedan finally pulled away from the curb and disappeared down Main Street. I noticed Ethan relax slightly as its taillights vanished into the distance. There, I said. They are gone. For tonight. The answer brought back the tension immediately. You really think someone is watching me? Ethan looked toward the window. I think someone noticed that I care about you. The words settled heavily between us. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I should have been angry. Instead, I found myself asking the question I had been avoiding for days. Why? Ethan blinked. Why what? Why do you care? The bookstore suddenly felt very quiet. Even the old wall clock seemed louder. Ethan stared at me for a long moment before answering. Because every time I think about leaving Cedar Creek behind, I find myself driving back. My heartbeat quickened. That is not an explanation. It is the only one I have. I looked away first. The honesty in his voice made it difficult to breathe normally. Before either of us could say anything else, the front door opened. My grandmother stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner next door. She stopped immediately when she saw Ethan. Her eyes moved from him to me and back again. Then she smiled. Not politely, not cautiously. The kind of smile that suggested she understood far more than either of us wanted her to. Well, she said cheerfully, setting the coffees on the counter. I was wondering when you were finally going to visit my bookstore properly. Ethan actually looked surprised. And for some reason, seeing that expression on his face made me smile for the first time all evening. My grandmother handed Ethan a cup of coffee as if he were an old family friend instead of the most complicated person who had ever walked into my life. Thank you, he said politely. The fact that Ethan Moretti sounded genuinely respectful to an 80-year-old woman should not have surprised me, yet somehow it did. Sit, my grandmother said, pointing toward the reading corner near the fireplace. Both of you. Neither of us argued. 10 minutes later, the bookstore felt different. Safer somehow. Rain tapped softly against the windows while warm lamplight spilled across the shelves. My grandmother sat in her favorite chair, knitting quietly, completely unbothered by the tension that had consumed the evening. Ethan sat across from me holding a coffee cup he had barely touched. You know, my grandmother said suddenly, Claire has always had terrible taste in men. I nearly choked on my drink. Ethan looked alarmingly interested. Grandma. What? She asked innocently. It is true. Ethan hid a smile behind his coffee. Do not encourage her, I warned him. I am not encouraging anything. His eyes met mine. I am learning. My grandmother laughed softly and returned to her knitting. For the first time since receiving the threatening message, I felt myself relax. The strange knot of anxiety in my chest loosened. The fear had not disappeared completely, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Maybe because Ethan was here. The realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Around 9 o'clock, my grandmother finally stood. "I am going home." She pointed a knitting needle toward Ethan. "Make sure she locks the door." Then she left before either of us could respond. Silence settled over the bookstore once more. Outside, Main Street had emptied. Most businesses were dark. Only the diner remained open beneath its glowing neon sign. Ethan stared into his coffee for several seconds. "Your grandmother likes me. That makes one of us." He looked up immediately. "You do not like me?" The question sounded almost sincere. I folded my arms. "I am still deciding." His smile returned. Smaller this time. More genuine. "Fair." Another silence followed. Not awkward. Just thoughtful. Then Ethan reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table between us. A photograph. I picked it up carefully. The image showed the bookstore 20 years earlier. Fresh paint. New signs. My grandmother. Standing proudly outside the front entrance. "Where did you get this?" I asked softly. "A local archive." I stared at the picture. "You really investigated my entire life." "Not your entire life." "Most of it." "Probably." I should have been annoyed. Instead, I found myself smiling despite my best efforts. Ethan watched me quietly. There was no calculation in his expression. No strategy. Just relief. As if seeing me smile mattered more than it should. Then his phone buzzed. The change was immediate. The warmth disappeared from his face. He read the message once. Then again. My stomach tightened. "What happened?" I asked. Ethan looked toward the window. The softness that had existed all evening vanished behind something colder. More protective. More focused. "Claire," he said quietly. "Tomorrow morning, I need you to trust me." A chill moved through me. Trust you about what? Ethan's eyes never left the dark street outside. Because someone just arrived in Cedar Creek looking for me. The bookstore felt impossibly quiet after Ethan spoke those words. The old clock above the register ticked steadily, filling the silence between us. I stared at him across the reading table, searching his face for answers. "Who arrived?" I asked. Ethan looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "Someone from my world." The answer did not help. "You keep saying that like it explains everything." A faint smile appeared, but it did not reach his eyes. "I know." Outside, the streetlights reflected against the damp pavement. Cedar Creek looked exactly the same as it always had. Peaceful. Familiar. Safe. Yet somehow everything felt different now. Ethan stood and walked toward the front window. His reflection merged with the darkness outside. "When I first came here," he said quietly, "I thought I would stay for an hour." I watched him carefully. "Then why did you keep coming back?" He laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because he already knew the answer. "You." The words settled over the room like falling snow. Simple. Honest. Impossible to misunderstand. My heart stumbled. Ethan turned toward me. For the first time since meeting him, there was no distance in his expression. No careful control. No mask. I spent years believing that everything in life could be managed if you worked hard enough. His voice remained calm. Problems could be solved. Obstacles could be moved. Situations could be controlled. He glanced around the bookstore. Then I met a woman who cared more about old books than expensive cars. I tried to hide my smile. Failed completely. And that bothered you. At first. His eyes softened. Then it became the only thing I could think about. The honesty stole my breath. Outside, a cold wind rattled the window panes. Somewhere down the street, a truck passed through town. Life continued as normal. Yet nothing felt normal anymore. "You barely know me," I whispered. Ethan shook his head. "I know you stay late to help customers find books they cannot afford." I blinked. "I know you skip lunch when the bookstore has a slow month." My surprise grew. "I know you worry about your grandmother when she pretends she is not tired." Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my chest. Ethan took a slow breath. "And I know that every time I leave Cedar Creek, I spend the entire drive wishing I was coming back." Silence followed. The kind that changed things. Not because of what was said. Because of what could no longer be ignored. My phone buzzed suddenly on the table. The sound made both of us look down. A new message appeared on the screen. Unknown number. Only 4 words. "He cannot protect you." I stared at the message. Then at Ethan. He looked neither angry nor afraid. Just determined. Completely certain. He stepped closer, and gently turned the phone face down on the table. Claire. My name sounded different when he said it. Softer. More careful. What? I asked quietly. Ethan held my gaze for several seconds. Then he said the one thing I never expected to hear from a man who seemed capable of controlling everything. I am not asking you to trust my world. His voice remained steady. I am asking you to trust me. And for the first time since this impossible story began, I realized the answer mattered just as much to me as it did to him.